I was designing a course that I teach at the University of California, Davis, on Iberian literature called the Iberian Mosaic. I was teaching it for the first time, and what I wanted to do was highlight the diversity of languages and literature spoken here on the peninsula. And I wanted to include Gibraltar, but knew absolutely nothing about literature from Gibraltar. And I began doing research and found Humbert's name and contacted him, I think first on Facebook. And he very generously sent me some of his work and answered questions, as well as got me in touch with other people. I also reached out to Mark Sanchez, who, much like Humbert, very generously got me in touch with a number of other people and provided me with background information. And their generosity really gave me the background to teach some of their texts in this course. I taught 2 short stories each by them. I wanted to highlight the fact that literature in Gibraltar has been written in both Spanish and English. And so I taught 2 of Mark's stories written in English, 2 of Humbert's written in Spanish. They were wildly popular among my students, which was very unexpected because I had never taught literature from Gibraltar before.
And you've highlighted that this strikes a chord with many other populations that also have this same bilingual aspect to their lives and to the language that they use.
Absolutely. California in general is a state that has a very large Spanish-speaking community. In a way, Spanish is almost the unofficial second language of California, and of course California was part of Mexico, called Alta California, to distinguish it from Baja California, which is still part of Mexico today, and only became part of the United States in 1848 as a result of the Mexican-American War. And we have a very large Spanish-speaking population, and even more particularly at my university, about 33% of the students identify as Chicano or Latino, meaning Mexican-American, or with families from Central America or elsewhere. And even more particularly in the Spanish program, the majority of my students consistently in my classes tend to be Mexican-American. And the themes that Humbert and Mark develop in their stories, their references to bilingualism, to the tensions caused by the border between Gibraltar and Spain, as well as issues of coming to a sense of one's identity as something that's formed from these different cultures, as well as that exists in between these 2 large cultures. All of these struck a chord with my students. And many of them chose to write final papers in the course about Gibraltarian literature. So much so that Gibraltar, if you take its population into account, was completely overrepresented among the final paper topics, which was a really interesting and gratifying experience, and that inspired me to continue my own research.
What have you found to be the defining characteristics of the Gibraltarian literature that you've taught, perhaps the way that it represents such a small and idiosyncratic place?
I don't know nearly enough about Gibraltarian literature at this point to be able to make that kind of broad characterization. One thing that I will say is that despite Gibraltar's small size and relatively small population, I've found an enormous diversity of perspectives and approaches to speaking about Gibraltar. And to speaking about life in general. Of course, there's no obligation, I would say, that any author has just to focus his or her work on the place where he or she is born. But one thing that does interest me and that I hope to develop into a book project is the way that writers from Gibraltar think about how they fit into the world geographically and how they think Gibraltar fits into that world. The story El Acordeonista is a good example of this by highlighting the way that Gibraltar exists in a kind of very complex relationship with the part of Spain, with Andalusia, that it lies next to. I would say the poet Trino Cruz, in his work translating Arabic language poets, and the way that he highlights the continuities between Gibraltar and northern Morocco and the Mediterranean at large, utilizes a sort of distinct strategy of situating Gibraltar geographically and culturally. And of course, there are writers who have talked about the relationship between Gibraltar and the UK, either in terms of the evacuation of the civilian population during the Second World War, or the complex colonial legacy, cultural connections, and so forth. So that's an interesting feature of the literature for me, these different strategies that writers have used to try to situate this unique place that they're from within this broader and much larger world.
So what response have you had from your students to the Gibraltarian literature that you've taught, and the way that you've taught it as well, with the focus on, for example, bilingualism and borders?
Very positive. I had one student tearing up when we discussed the end of El Acordeonista. I received final papers that said very interesting things about Gibraltarian literature, sometimes in conjunction with the Mexican American or Chicano experience, or with reference to California. It was, for many students, it was their favorite part of the course. And as a result, a colleague of mine in the Chicano Studies Department, Maceo Montoya, and I are putting together a grant that we hope to submit really in the next couple days, that would fund a sort of a comparative analysis of literature from Chicano writers in California, as well as Gibraltarian writers.
Well, it took me by storm, really. I was very taken aback when somebody from so far away as California got in touch with me one day about a year ago and wanted to know more about me and what I had written. It was really an honor and a privilege to learn that somebody as important as a university professor from such an institution as the University of California had decided that my work and Mark Sanchez's work was worth dipping into and presented to the students for study.
So obviously this course focuses on bilingualism and borders. How do you approach these subjects in your work?
They do form an important part of it, really. The border, and not just the physical border, but other borders between individuals, between groups, between cultural groups, between different nationalities. All this forms an important part of my writing, as does the evacuation, really. It always crops up in some way or another in the stories that I've written.
So how do you incorporate bilingualism into your work, and especially the language in which you tell your stories?
I decided, first of all, to write the stories in English, right? But then if they didn't ring true, to write about people like my parents, who only spoke in Spanish because they belonged to another generation, and who spoke to us, their children, in Spanish all the time. It just didn't ring true to put words into somebody like my mother and people of that age in English. So I switched over and wrote them in Spanish. As I've explained previously in many interviews, I didn't learn English till I was 5. So really my maternal language is really Spanish, and I'm much more comfortable writing in Spanish.
What projects are you currently working on?
I've been working for the last year and a half now on a biography of Cecil Gomez and of our drama group, which started in 1956. So it's 60 years worth of drama, of theatre, amateur theatre, but I cover over 200 productions, one-act plays and full-length plays, and loads of photographs. About 600 photographs are to be included in it. The text is written, but fitting in all the photographs and getting material from different people who have scrapbooks and archives and all sorts of things takes an enormous amount of time. I almost gave up in despair, really, because writing non-fiction is very different to writing fiction. I mean, what I like really is writing fiction, not non-fiction. But this landed on my lap, and I couldn't really say no.
And do you have any other fiction or poetry works coming up?
Yes, well, that's coming up. I'll be editing, I'll be publishing all the stories that I've written. I've only published 20, but there are another 21, 22, which are unpublished, and I'm going to put them all together and publish them in 4 little volumes, which will be coming out, I hope, during the coming year. And then there's a volume of poetry in English that's also in the back burner, and some more in Spanish, and well, we'll see how it goes.